September 1965, a closed plenum of the Soviet Communist Party in Moscow. On paper, the USSR is still a rising industrial superpower. In reality, the numbers are flashing red. Growth is slowing. Planned failures are piling up. The planning bureaucracy is drowning in its own paperwork. And at the center of it all, Premier Alexei Kosygin steps up with what is, in effect, a rescue plan for a command economy that has quietly stopped working. His argument is disarmingly simple. We built a system that can move tanks and steel, but it cannot answer one basic question. Is this factory actually worth keeping alive? For 4 decades, Soviet industry has been run by output targets, not profitability. Managers win bonuses for fulfilling quantitative plans, not for saving capital, upgrading technology, or responding to what people actually want. The result? Warehouses of unsold goods, chronic shortages of what is needed, and systematic misallocation masquerading as full employment. Kosygin's 1965 package tries to fix that. It proposes something radical for a supposedly post-capitalist system. Make profitability and sales the main measures of enterprise success. Let factories keep part of their profits in special funds for investment and bonuses. Give managers more autonomy over product mix, hiring, and modernization, backed by bank credit with interest. And use computers to tighten planning and pricing, instead of throwing more clerks at the problem.
In other words, keep socialism, but import the discipline of a balance sheet. This is the 1965 rescue plan. What almost no one in that room will admit out loud is that this is not just a technocratic tweak. It is an open confession that the original Stalinist planning model is mathematically unsustainable in a complex modern economy. By 1965, the Soviet economy is, by one internal estimate, over 1,000 times more complex than it was in 1928, while planning methods are basically the same. On another floor in the Soviet system, a different group of technocrats is quietly working on the other half of the rescue, a nationwide computer network, OGAS, designed by Viktor Glushkov to automate data collection and planning in real time and prevent the bureaucracy from collapsing under its own information load. In 1965, the USSR has both pieces of a potential escape route: a plan to inject hard incentives into soft planning, a plan to build a cybernetic nervous system for the entire economy, and then Moscow walks away. This video is about what that rescue plan really was, why the leadership abandoned it, and which economies today are running the same playbook. Write down the hard reform blueprint, then quietly choose stagnation over pain. Because this is not just history. This is a template for how late-stage systems pretend to reform, and it's being repeated right now in some of the world's biggest economies.
Before we can understand why 1965 mattered, we need to understand what the Soviet system was actually trying to rescue. From the 1930s onwards, the USSR ran on a very specific governance logic. One central bureaucracy sets output targets, allocates inputs, and fixes prices. Enterprises are judged by physical plan fulfillment, tons, units, kilometers, not profit. Shortages and surpluses are patched by administrative orders, not market signals. As long as the economy is relatively simple and growing fast, steel, coal, tanks, tractors, that model looks impressive from the outside, but every 5-year plan increases the number of products, technologies, and interdependencies. By the early 1960s, Soviet economists and computer scientists can see the problem in cold equations. The planning task is exploding combinatorially. Glushkov, the father of OGAS, famously calculates that if the USSR keeps using paper-based planning with the same methods, by 1980 the country would need the entire adult population working as planners to keep up with the calculations. That's the mathematical flaw, a system designed for a 1930s industrial structure now trying to manage a late 20th century economy. With no price flexibility to reveal real scarcities, no profit signals to indicate whether capital is being destroyed or preserved, no information architecture capable of handling the required data in real time.
Inside this architecture, success means hitting gross output targets. So managers hoard inputs, overproduce heavy items, underproduce quality, and treat inventories as a shield against planned shocks. Innovation is dangerous because it threatens planned stability. Risk-taking is punished, not rewarded. Kosygin's rescue plan is the first serious attempt to admit this in policy language. The reform,
reduces the number of central plan indicators and elevates profitability and sales as key metrics, allows enterprises to keep a portion of profits in funds for development, bonuses, and housing, introduces bank credit with interest as a discipline mechanism for investment, starts revising wholesale prices to better reflect costs. On paper, it's a move from produce what we tell you at any cost to produce what's profitable for the plan and be rewarded for efficiency. This is not capitalism, but it is an attempt to hardwire incentives into a system that has been pretending to operate above them. Parallel to this, OGAS is conceived as the information backbone that can actually make such a hybrid model work. A three-tier computer network with a central hub in Moscow, regional centers, and thousands of local terminals, all feeding real-time data into planning models. Look at the logic. The 1965 reform attacks the incentive side of the failure. OGAS attacks the information side. Together they form a coherent rescue architecture for a system facing sovereign risk from within, not from foreign debt, but from its own inability to allocate capital rationally. In a resilient system, this is the moment you double down on reform. In the Soviet system, it becomes the high-water mark of honesty before the retreat.
After the 1965 plenum, the reforms roll out in waves. The first 43 enterprises shift to the new model in early 1966, then hundreds more, then thousands. By the end of 1967, roughly 7,000 industrial enterprises, key trucking firms, and all 25 railroad systems are operating under the new rules, about 20% of total industrial output. The new indicators, rentabilnost and realizacja, start to matter. Enterprises that hit profit targets can pay substantial bonuses and finance investment from their own retained earnings. Pay packets for engineers and managers rise faster than for rank-and-file workers, reflecting the regime's deliberate push to reward technical and managerial performance. For a brief window, it works as advertised. Growth in 1966-1970 outpaces the previous 5-year period. Measures like sales per ruble of capital improve. Plants begin shedding surplus machinery because idle capital now counts against profitability. From the outside, this looks like a classic partial liberalization, enough autonomy and financial discipline to squeeze extra efficiency out of the existing system, but still under the umbrella of central planning.
The deeper pattern, though, is already visible. Managers quickly learn to game the new metrics. They push for generous price settings to guarantee profit. They prioritize easy-to-sell items, not necessarily what the broader plan needs. They lobby ministries for favorable profit norms and deductions. The rescue plan has introduced market-like incentives into an environment where political control over prices and credit is still absolute. It's a hybrid regime, and hybrids are inherently unstable. Either the incentives start to dictate policy, or policy crushes the incentives.
Meanwhile, the information side of the plan is stalling. Glushkov's OGAS network is designed to be the technical spine of a modernized planned economy, data from thousands of factories feeding into regional centers and then into Moscow, allowing planners to simulate scenarios, adjust plans, and eventually even replace money with electronic accounting. Western observers take this seriously. Internal U.S. assessments in the 1960s explicitly warned that a fully implemented Soviet cybernetic network could create tremendous increments in economic productivity and give the USSR a significant advantage in production technology and control systems. Inside the Soviet system, however, OGAS runs into institutional resistance. The military fears losing informational monopoly. Existing ministries fear losing control over their data silos. Regional elites fear direct oversight from Moscow's computers. By 1970, when Glushkov asks for the serious funding needed to build the network, no less than 100 billion rubles, with a projected 5-fold payoff, the Politburo says no. The 24th Party Congress in 1971 approves only a modest expansion of local information systems, not the national network. OGAS is effectively killed. Think about what that means for the rescue plan. The incentive fix, profit indicators, is partially in place. The information fix, real-time data and models, is abandoned. You now have enterprises being pushed to act more like firms in a profit-driven environment, but the center is still planning with blind, lagged, and distorted information. The risk is obvious: local rationality, system-level chaos. And that's exactly where the Soviet system starts to drift. By the end of the 1960s, the rescue plan hits its political ceiling. Party elites are unsettled by several trends. Wages have risen, but productivity improvements are uneven. Some managers are becoming too autonomous, treating their enterprises as fiefdoms. Profit, as a key indicator, is ideologically uncomfortable and politically risky. Between 1969 and 1971, key elements of the reform are softly reversed. Profit-based incentives are diluted. Ministries reassert detailed control. The pressure for deeper price reform and wider enterprise autonomy is quietly dropped. And then the real anesthetic arrives, the 1973 oil shock. World oil prices soar. For an energy exporter like the USSR, this is a windfall. Suddenly, hard currency starts flowing in. Growth, which had been slowing, gets a temporary reprieve fueled by commodity exports, not by productivity. In that environment, the political appetite for painful structural reform collapses. The leadership effectively makes a choice. Why fight ministries, overhaul prices, and rewire the incentive system when we can pay for stability with oil? This is the real moment Moscow abandons the 1965 rescue plan. It keeps just enough of it to claim that the system has been reformed, but not enough to confront the core governance problem, a command structure unable to impose hard budget constraints on itself. The result is the infamous era of stagnation. Headline stability, but falling growth rates, aging capital stock, rising hidden imbalances, and a planning system that has lost whatever edge it once had.
Now we pivot forward. Because if you strip away the Soviet flags, the pattern of the 1965 rescue plan and its abandonment is disturbingly familiar. Admit the model is broken. Publish a grand technocratic blueprint of structural reforms. Implement the easy parts. Hit political resistance. Let a temporary windfall or macro patch substitute for real change. Declare victory and move on, while the underlying math gets worse. Consider Japan's Abenomics. It was explicitly framed as 3 arrows: aggressive monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and structural reform to revive productivity and competitiveness. A decade later, analysts across the spectrum note that the structural reform arrow was fired last and weakest. Key labor and product market reforms were watered down or postponed, leaving Japan heavily dependent on monetary expansion. The rescue plan existed, on slides, in speeches, in white papers, but the hardest parts, the ones that would have truly rebalanced power and incentives, were quietly left on the table. Look at China after the 2013 Third Plenum. The plenum unveiled a sweeping blueprint with around 60 reform proposals, giving markets a decisive role, reforming state-owned enterprises, fixing local government finance, overhauling hukou and land rights. Over the subsequent decade, progress was partial and uneven. High-profile analyses, Chinese and international, highlight how many of the most sensitive competition and SOE reforms have stalled or been selectively implemented, while credit expansion and state-led investment remain the default response to slowdowns. Again, the pattern isn't no plan, it's too many plans, not enough follow-through, especially on the pieces that would diminish entrenched interests or reduce the state's discretionary control over the economy. You can extend the logic to other advanced economies that repeatedly announce growth strategies, productivity agendas, or structural reform packages while leaning ever harder on monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and asset inflation whenever growth falters. The exact institutions differ. The pattern of governance avoidance does not. In all these cases, the 1965 Soviet story is a warning. A rescue plan that can be abandoned is not really a rescue plan. It's a narrative device bought on credit.
So what did Moscow actually abandon in 1965-1971? Not just a set of technical fixes. It abandoned the only plausible route to long-term resilience for a command economy that had run into its complexity limits, a willingness to subject enterprises and ministries to hard financial constraints, a commitment to rebuild the information architecture with computers and real-time data, and crucially, a readiness to let those changes alter the internal balance of power. Instead, the Soviet leadership chose what many systems choose in their late phase: stability over adaptability, control over information richness, short-term political comfort over long-term institutional viability. The consequences were not immediate collapse, but managed stagnation, an economy drifting sideways for 2 decades, losing its ability to generate genuine innovation and becoming ever more vulnerable to shocks it could no longer metabolize. Here's the core resilience takeaway.
Real rescue plans are not collections of clever reforms. They are commitments to accept hard constraints, even when they hurt the people in charge. A system is only as resilient as its ability to lock in reforms that bite powerful actors, protect its information channels from being filtered, falsified, or shut down. Resist the temptation to swap structural change for windfalls, whether that windfall is oil, cheap money, or a credit boom. When you see an economy publishing thick reform blueprints, making partial moves, then defaulting back to the same credit-fueled, politically convenient model, you are watching a 1965 moment play out in slow motion. Japan's long slog after underpowered structural reform, China's uneasy balance between stated market reforms and a renewed emphasis on party-led allocation, other heavily indebted advanced economies relying on central banks as permanent shock absorbers. All of them are running versions of the same test. Will they execute their rescue plans fully, or will they abandon them when they threaten entrenched interests? The Soviet Union answered that question in the 1970s. It chose to treat its rescue plan as an optional extra, not a point of no return. By the time the bill arrived in the 1980s, the system no longer had the institutional flexibility or the credibility to recover. If you live, work, or invest in any modern economy that has already written its own 1965-style blueprint, that choice is not an abstraction. It shows up in the future value of your savings, the credibility of your pension promises, the stability of your job in sectors protected by policy rather than performance. On this channel, we treat Soviet history as a forensic lab for exactly these questions. If you want to understand whether today's rescue plans are real reforms or just refined versions of Moscow's abandoned blueprint, this is where we dissect them. Because the next era of stagnation won't be called that on the front page. It will be sold as stability, temporary measures, and targeted support, right up until the moment the system runs out of room to pretend the math still works.